guys, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel. For those who's new, my name is Christian and I love plants, and in today's video we are going to talk all about potting mix and potting soil for your indoor plants. I want to share with you guys my experience, as a beginner and kind of my journey since then when it came to the different types of potting soil and potting mix I use for some of my houseplants, as well as some of the ingredients that makes up a lot of these potting mix, and explain kind of what they do or what they're supposed to do. And then I'll go through some of my houseplants and share with you guys kind of the soil mix or potting mix that I have them in, and then we'll do a bit of repotting, and hopefully by then you'll have an idea on what each of these, whether it's pre-packaged potting mix or more of the ingredients, what they do, and hopefully it'll give you a better idea on how to mix your own potting mix if you choose to do so. So we'll start with your pre-packaged potting mix. There's typically two that you're going to come across. There's your potting mix, regular, and there's your cacti and succulent potting mix. Most regular potting mix you'll come across at your local garden center includes three types of ingredients: peat moss, fir bark, and perlite or vermiculite. Sometimes you'll come across a premium potting mix like what I use, which is Pro Mix, and that includes obviously those three ingredients with a bit more of a fertilizer or a slow release fertilizer, and just a bit more nutrients with the soil. So that's your regular or premium potting mix. Now you'll also come across a pre-packaged cacti or succulent mix, and again it includes those three ingredients. However, there's probably a little bit less peat moss on it because you want your cacti and succulent to have a lot of drainage, so there's probably a lot more perlite, and in addition there's a lot more sand in it to make it a little bit more gritty, again to allow a lot of aeration, because cacti and succulents, they do not like to sit in water. So typically when you water your succulent, you want that water to drain through, enough for your succulent and your cacti to obviously absorb a lot of the nutrients and water, through the roots and through its leaves. And by then, the rest of the water will evaporate because that soil is a lot more airy and more gritty, if that makes sense. For the most part, you can use your premium potting mix or regular potting mix and cacti soil on most of your houseplants. And I remember when I first started, I actually just used cacti soil and potting mix together. I would just mix 50-50 of it because, again, I want most of my houseplants, especially a lot of your common one, to allow a bit of that, hold a bit of that nutrients, but at the same time, the cacti soil will allow it to create a bit more drainage. Now you're gonna come across perlite or vermiculite. Again, this is part of the ingredients when it comes to pre-packaged potting mix or cacti soil. These are made from volcanic rocks, processed, and they're these white looking balls, almost looks like a styrofoam, very light, very airy. And what these guys do is they create space between the soil, again, allowing your soil mix to have a lot more drainage and aeration throughout the soil. The difference between perlite and vermiculite is perlite doesn't hold or retain any of the moisture or nutrients, while vermiculite does do that. So it really depends on the plant, whether they prefer to have a little bit more moisture and nutrients, or like a cacti soil where they don't need to have a lot of that. So I don't use vermiculite on most of my houseplants. I do use a lot of perlite, especially when I was starting off as a beginner. Again, I started off with just regular potting mix and then added cacti soil, and then now my go-to mix is really perlite, cacti soil, and potting mix, and I do about a third of each of these. Especially if my plants is a little bit bigger and requires a little bit more of a larger container, I use about a third potting mix, cacti soil, and then a third of perlite. Now there is something called pumice, which is also made by volcanic rocks, not as processed as a perlite or vermiculite. And you guys can tell here that they almost look like pebbles and rocks. They're very, very hard to squeeze, unlike a perlite where you can actually squeeze it and it'll turn into dust. And why I like pumice is because they're a little bit heavier. So again, what they do is they create separation between the soil, allowing a bit of drainage. But unlike perlite, where after a few times watering your plants, that perlite will typically raise to the top of your soil, so it's no longer creating a bit of that space within the soil. While pumice, on the other hand, is a little bit heavier, it stays within the soil medium even after a few times of watering your plants. So I am starting to use a lot more pumice now in my go-to soil mix. Instead of the perlite, I'll now add a bit more pumice. Sometimes I'll combine both of them, just again to add a bit of extra drainage, because pumice is really hard for me to find here in Canada. Not many local garden centers have them. I actually have to order mine online. So I'll provide a link in the description below for some of the products I use. But yeah, so that's kind of my go-to standard soil medium soil mix, potting mix, premium potting mix, cacti soil, Perlite, and Pumice. Now let's talk about peat moss. So peat moss is one of the main ingredients when it comes to prepackaged potting mix, premium potting mix, or cacti soil. And what they do is they help release a lot of the moisture to the plant's roots, as well as ensure that that nutrients remains there even after watering it or washing it down. It also has a lot of organic matter, which again, certain plants prefer to have a lot more nutrients, organic matter, and retain a bit of the moisture, while certain plants don't need that as much. So typically if you don't have any prepackaged like potting mix or cacti soil, you can make kind of your own version of it, especially if you have peat moss, perlite, and pumice, and you can really mix that together, half and half, maybe half peat moss, half perlite or pumice, and you should have a pretty good potting mix for most of your common houseplants. Now you'll also come across like orchid bark mix, and I have here the Miracle Grow one, and you guys can see here it's a coarse blend. It has a lot of orchid bark, and what I typically use this for is obviously for my orchids, but sometimes I'll mix it with my potting mix, especially when it comes to those plants that are a little bit more sensitive to roots, but at the same time it needs to kind of retain a bit of the moisture. So what an orchid bark does, or orchid mix, is it creates quick drainage, but at the same time retain a bit of that moisture. And then recently I'm starting to experiment with cocoa husk, which is a byproduct of obviously the coconut industry. It's different from cocoa coir, which is just a little bit more processed than the husk I'm using here. Cocoa coir is pretty much very similar to peat moss. It looks and does the same thing, just a little bit more premium and more expensive. So I'm not using any of the cocoa coir, but I am using these cocoa husks, primarily similar to maybe like an orchid bark, where it allows and creates a bit of separation within my potting mix, but again, it kind of helps retain a bit of that moisture and releasing it to the roots or plant whenever it's needed. But yeah, so far those are the different types of potting mix I've come across or started to use. Sometimes I'll actually get like a pre-mixed one by a specialty garden center or nursery. For example, I'm using this one from Crystal Star Nursery, which includes cocoa chips, bark, pumice, expanded clay, and peat chunks. And this is great for a lot of those plants that require a lot of aeration as well as humidity. So typically I use this for more of my rare plants like my Philodendron melanochrysum, the gigas, the anthuriums. And I'm debating if I'm gonna plant my new Monstera albo into this tropical mix that's already pre-made, or I'm gonna kind of make my own, but we'll figure that out in a second here. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about some of the plants I have and the type of potting mix I use for them. So here we have my Thai constellation Monstera, and I remember when I repotted this guy from water, because he was in water for like a good 6 months, and I wanted to pot him in this 10-inch container that you guys see right here. So the potting mix I use here is Cacti Soil, regular potting mix, and a lot of perlite. At that time I didn't have pumice, so I used perlite, but the ratio I used was about 50% potting mix and about like 30% cacti soil, and then about 10% perlite. Because it is a tropical plant that requires a bit of the moisture and humidity, I wanted to make sure there was a lot more potting mix than cacti soil, but at the same time creating a bit of that drainage and aeration, because I don't trust myself from overwatering, so I'm very conscious of that. But yeah, so far it's thriving really well, and most of my monsteras in the past I've always used that type of potting mix and ratio. Now I am planning on repotting this guy, and I'm debating if I'm going to move him into the specialty pre-made potting mix, or I'm gonna make my own with pumice, cocoa husk, peat moss, potting mix, cacti soil, and a bit of orchid bark. I haven't decided yet, but for now, this guy is fine. Now, when it comes to my Ficus elasticas, whether it is the ruby that you see here, my burgundy, or my teneki, all of them I use kind of my go-to potting mix, which is regular potting soil, cacti soil, and perlite. And the ratio I use, I remember with this guy, I think I use about 50% regular potting mix, 50% cacti soil, and I guess it's not really 50% because then I would throw in a handful or two of perlite. For the most part, that's my go-to potting mix. My Pilia peperomioides, this guy right here, he's in this like 12-inch container, and when I repotted this guy, pretty much since he was a pup, every time I would repot him, I would always use regular potting mix, cacti soil, and then perlite. And I think what I want to do next time, if I do need to repot this guy, I'm probably going to use more of the pumice instead of the perlite, because again, after a few times watering this guy, I'm noticing the perlite is rising at the top, so it's no longer creating that separation between the soil. And but yeah, so far he's doing really well. You know, I am noticing that the water is draining pretty quickly. So I might start adding a bit more peat moss just at the top to top this guy off a bit, just to make sure he can retain a bit of that moisture a little bit longer than what he's used to, because I'm finding that I'm now watering this guy like once a week for this size. So part of it is because he's so huge, and a lot of his babies is obviously, you know, taking a lot of that energy from the mother plant. All my pothos are also in my go-to potting mix, cacti soil, regular potting soil, and then perlite. And yeah, so even my alocasia silver dragon here, like I have this guy, I think in about 60% premium potting mix, 30% maybe cacti soil, and then the rest some perlite. And so far he's doing really well. I do have sphagnum moss at the top here as a dressing. Sphagnum moss just kind of helps retain a bit of that moisture, creates a bit of humidity, and this guy is doing really well. When it comes to some of my rare plants like the Philodendron melochrysum, the gigas, you know, one of my anthuriums, I have them in the tropical mix by Crystal Star Nursery. So that allows a lot of, you know, well drainage and aeration through the roots, but at the same time retaining a bit of the nutrients and humidity. But this Anthurium clarinarium, I actually have this in my own potting mix that I made using cocoa husk, orchid bark, pumice, perlite, and peat moss. And I blended that all together and I potted this guy up. While this Anthurium, Philodendron, I have this guy in the tropical mix. And I'm finding that both are in terracotta pots. My own mix that I made, I'm finding that the water holds a little bit longer, and I don't need to water this guy as often than I do with this one. And I think part of the reason is because the cocoa husk that's inside this potting mix, again, helps create that drainage, but also retains a bit of the moisture, as well as a lot more orchid bark. While this guy has more of the expanded clay, as well as the peat chunk versus like more on the peat moss. So far, both are doing really well. Again, this just needs to be watered a little bit more often than this one, but this one has new growth, and this one also has new growth. It's just taking a lot longer to show up. So yeah, really experimenting when it comes to, you know, some of the soil mix I want to try with some of the plants. I think the key thing is understanding what your plant requires and what they need to be able to then determine, you know, what kind of soil mix or ratio of the different ingredients you want to include in your potting mix. So key thing is understand your plant, what they want, what they prefer, and then understand each of the ingredients and what they're meant to do to be able to kind of give you an idea on how to make your potting mix. Now what we want to do is obviously do a bit of repotting. I want to repot my Philodendron Birkin because this guy is, I think, root bound, plus he's got a bit of a couple pups that I want to separate and have it in its own pot, as well as repot the Ponytail Tom. So obviously two different types of plants, and we'll kind of figure out what soil mix we want to use for them. All right guys, so let's start with the Philodendron Birkin, and let's remove this guy from the old soil, old container, and let's see what we're dealing with in terms of the mother plant and a few of the babies that we see here. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright guys, so I'm inspecting this Philodendron Birkin, and the babies around it are pretty attached together with the mother plant, and I don't want to damage the root ball. So I think what we're going to do is just keep these guys intact and plant them together. And maybe we can get this guy similar to my Pelia peperomioides there, where all the babies are attached to its mother, and see how big we can get this guy. We just obviously will need a bigger container so this guy has room to grow and expand and doesn't, you know, start getting root bound. So, all right guys, so we found a bigger container, and I think what we're gonna use is a lot of peat moss, so maybe a handful of it, and then, or maybe two, you know, because it is a big container. And then I want to add a lot of pumice and perlite. So why don't we do a bit of perlite first? And then what I think I want to add is some cocoa husk to again create a bit of that aeration, but at the same time retain a bit of the moisture as well. But before we do that, let's add a bit of pumice. Again, you know, pumice I don't have much of, so I do like to mix a bit of the perlite with it as well. And then I think I want to add a bit of like regular potting mix, just to add a bit more volume in there as well, because I don't really have, it's a big container, so we're gonna wanna obviously, you know, fill this guy up and then see how this Philodendron Birkin does. Hopefully it's not too big for its size. You know, it is, like I said, it was starting to grow really small, the new leaves I noticed, because it was starting to outgrow the size he was in. So I have my mix here. I'm gonna obviously mix it really, really well. And you know, just based on what I'm noticing right now, just the feel of this, it's a bit coarse. So I think what I wanna add is just a bit more peat moss and maybe a bit more potting mix as well. So I'm gonna do that right now. So again, you know, I normally will kind of just eyeball my measurement and really just based on how I feel or how the soil feels to me is kind of the way I go about determining my soil mix. But, you know, as a beginner, you know, I usually just went through my regular potting mix, Cacti Soil and Perlite. And you know what, if I didn't have Coco Husk or Peat Moss, I probably would have used my go-to mix for this Philodendron Birkin and it would have been fine anyway, but I'm gonna try a bit of this and see how we do here. So I'm gonna fill up my container. This is good. Alright guys, so here he is. The Philodendron Birkin is now in an 8-inch container with its new soil mix and medium that I blended together, and I'm hoping he's gonna thrive, but we'll obviously do a houseplant update, you know, a couple months down the road and check in on this guy. So next one we wanna do is the Ponytail Tom. And like I said, I've had this guy for 3 years in its nursery container. Got this guy from IKEA. Because it's one of those plants that require very little watering, it does need a bit more of that well drainage type of soil. So typically you can just use cacti or succulent soil for this guy, but I think I'm gonna add a bit more perlite or pumice in it, just to be on the safe side, because again, I sometimes don't trust myself. I tend to overwater. Let's go ahead and prepare this guy, remove him from his nursery container, and then get his soil mix and new container ready. All right guys, so I'm gonna remove him from his container, and you guys can see right here, you can see how sandy this soil that he's in, because again, does not require a lot of water, really needs that well-drained soil. So I'm gonna try and see how much of this old soil we can remove without damaging the roots, because like I said, this guy been here for about 3 years now. So let's go ahead and do this. All right guys, so I removed a lot of the old soil as best as I could, and I think what I want to do is plant this guy. So he was in the 6-inch container. I think we're gonna move him all the way to a 10-inch container, and that way we don't have to repot this guy for another good 3 or 4 years, because like I said, I really want this guy to grow as big as possible. Slow grower, but you know, at the same time, I haven't really expanded the container, so we'll see how well he does. But let me go ahead and clean this up, and then we'll make our soil mix here, and then we'll do our repotting. All right guys, so we now have our Ponytail Tom. We remove a lot of the old soil, and you guys can tell that the soil was in a very sandy, gritty type of medium. So what we want to obviously recreate the same thing. I'm going to use the pre-packaged Cacti Soil, but I'm definitely going to add a lot more pumice and perlite into it, so that way it creates a bit more of that drainage. And I did see a bit of orchid bark chips, so I might add a bit of that as well, and we'll repot this guy obviously in a larger container, a 10-inch one. So why don't we go ahead and do that now. Now I'm gonna add a bit more perlite. I'm feeling that it's not as gritty as I'd like it to be, so we're gonna do that. Guys, so I think we got enough soil here to place this guy on top, and then we'll see how he sits. We obviously want to make sure the roots are going to be in that soil, but at the same time not sit too low. So I think this is going to be good. Damn, man, I'm so excited to have this guy grow really, really big. And you know, now that he's got a bit more room, I'm hoping he can thrive. And he's been thriving for 3 years in that tiny 6-inch container. And you guys saw there that the roots were pretty a bit bound because it was starting to circle up. But now that he's got room here in this 10-inch container. Man, I'm thinking of having this guy outside, so that way it can really thrive and grow this growing season. So there you guys have it. Hopefully you learned a thing or two when it comes to the potting mix and potting soil you can use for the different types of houseplants you have. Again, this is just my experience from the early days when I was just using pre-packaged potting mix and cacti soil to now kind of mixing and blending a few of my own when it comes to the different types of ingredients you can use. It really does depend on the type of plant, and I think that's the most important thing is understand your plant, what they prefer, and then from there provide the potting mix that they will thrive in. So other than that, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. But I'm curious, what kind of potting mix do you guys use? What is your go-to potting mix when it comes to most of your common houseplants? Comment below and let me know. Aside from that, enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.